She had nothing. He wanted nothing. And the most dangerous woman in the Idaho Territory wanted them both dead. When Elena Whitaker rode into Frost Ridge Canyon with a dead father's name on her lips and a stack of debt notices in her bag, she didn't come looking for love. She came looking for a way to survive. What she found was a scarred, silent man who hadn't smiled in years, and a frontier war that would test every ounce of courage either of them had ever owned. Like this video. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. November 1887. Frost Ridge Canyon, Idaho Territory. The wolf had been following her for 3 miles. Elena Whitaker knew it the way her father had taught her to know things in the wild. Not by looking, but by feeling. The silence between the pine trees was wrong. Too still. Too watchful. The kind of silence that breathed. She kept her eyes on the frozen trail ahead, and her right hand loose near the small iron pistol tucked against her hip. A .32 caliber revolver her father had pressed into her palm 4 days ago, in a hospital room that smelled of carbolic acid and unfinished prayers. Don't hesitate, he told her. On this frontier, hesitation is just a slower way of dying. She hadn't hesitated once since then. She hadn't slept much either. The horse beneath her, a dun mare named Cora, aging and stubborn, and the one living creature she had left in the world, climbed the ridge trail with the mechanical determination of an animal that had seen worse winters and survived them all. The saddle was cold. The sky above the canyon walls was the color of old pewter, heavy and low, threatening snow before nightfall. Around her, the Idaho wilderness stretched in every direction like something that had never heard of mercy and had no interest in learning. Elena rode on. The name she carried was her only currency, Silas Mercer. Her father, Thomas Whitaker, schoolteacher, part-time land surveyor, and the most quietly principled man Elena had ever known, had spoken that name only twice in her entire life. Once when she was 8 years old, after a bad dream woke her and she'd found her father sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, staring at nothing. "There's a man named Silas Mercer," he'd told her softly, as if thinking aloud. "I did something for him once, something that mattered. If I'm ever gone and the world closes in on you, find him." She'd thought nothing of it then. Children rarely do. The second time was 18 days ago, in that hospital room, his voice barely above a whisper, his hands cold beneath hers. The debt notices had already begun arriving. 3 creditors, a landlord, a bank with no patience, and less sympathy. The small house in Caldwell where she'd grown up was already spoken for. Everything her father had built across 40 years of careful, honest living had quietly collapsed beneath debts she hadn't known existed, accumulated during the last year of his illness, when pride kept him silent and medicine kept the wolves at bay, temporarily. "Frost Ridge Canyon," he'd said, "northwest of the Sawtooth Range cutoff. Ask for Silas Mercer. Tell him Thomas Whitaker sent you." A pause. The rattle in his chest that she'd learned to dread. "Tell him I finally called the debt." She hadn't understood what that meant. She still wasn't entirely sure she did, but she understood the notices stacked in her saddlebag. She understood the $12 remaining in her purse. She understood that in 31 days, she would be entirely without shelter in the middle of an Idaho winter. A 25-year-old woman alone in a territory where alone was another word for dead. So she rode toward the name her dying father had given her, because it was the only direction she had. The cabin appeared between 2 enormous ponderosa pines as the trail crested the ridge, and Elena's first thought was that it looked like a man who had stopped caring what the world thought of him. It was solid. She'd give it that. The logs were thick and well-fitted, the kind of construction that took patience and skill and genuine knowledge of winter. But the place had a severity to it, an absence of anything soft. No flower boxes, no porch chairs. The woodpile stacked against the eastern wall was enormous, practical, almost aggressive in its practicality. Everything about the property spoke of survival maintained and comfort deliberately refused. There were 2 other structures beyond the cabin, a hay barn with a patched roof and a smaller outbuilding that might have been a smokehouse. A split-rail fence enclosed a modest paddock where 3 horses stood in the cold, their breath making small clouds in the November air. Beyond the paddock, the canyon fell away in a sweep of juniper and frozen creek bed. It was, Elena thought, an extraordinarily lonely place. She stopped Cora at the fence line and sat there for a moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She'd rehearsed what she would say a dozen times on the trail. She'd arranged the words carefully, like a legal argument, which was perhaps appropriate given what her father had taught her. Now, sitting in front of a stranger's cabin in a place she'd never been, holding nothing but a dead man's name and a desperate hope, all those careful words scattered like startled birds. Just say the name, she told herself. Start with the name. She dismounted, tied Cora to the fence post, and walked toward the cabin door. She'd raised her hand to knock when the door opened from the inside. Silas Mercer looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected, in a place where unexpected things are usually trouble. He was taller than she'd imagined. Not the lean, wiry type of frontier man she'd grown accustomed to seeing, but broad through the shoulders with the kind of physical weight that came from years of genuine labor rather than any vanity about strength. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that hadn't met a razor in several days, and eyes the precise color of Winter Creek water, gray-green and very still and giving away nothing at all. He was, she realized with a start, not old. Older than her, considerably, but not old. There was something about the stillness in his face that had made her expect an elderly man, the way her father had sometimes described him. But this man was somewhere in his late 30s, and the lines in his face were from weather and experience, not years. He looked at her. Then he looked past her, scanning the tree line with the automatic, unhurried thoroughness of someone who had been doing that his entire adult life and had never entirely stopped. "Help you?" he said. His voice was low, not unfriendly, not particularly friendly either. "I'm looking for Silas Mercer," Elena said. Found him. She had prepared for this moment. She had prepared for it across 4 days of hard riding and cold camps and the particular kind of loneliness that follows grief into every quiet hour. She'd prepared every word. What came out was, "My father is dead." Something shifted in his face. Not much. A careful man, she thought. A man who'd learned to hold things close. "What was his name?" Silas asked. "Thomas Whitaker." The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. Deeper. Weighted. Silas Mercer stood in his doorway looking at her with an expression she couldn't read entirely, something between recognition and a pain he was choosing not to show. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come inside," he said. The interior of the cabin was as spare as the exterior suggested it would be, but clean, meticulously, almost fiercely clean, in the way of a man who had nothing decorative and therefore made an art of order. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a wood stove burning steadily against the far wall, radiating a heat that hit Elena like a physical thing after the cold outside. A narrow bed against one wall, blankets folded with military precision, shelves holding provisions, tools, a small stack of books that surprised her. On one wall, a rifle and a shotgun hung on wooden pegs. Beneath them, on a shelf, an old army revolver in a cracked leather holster. There were no photographs, no keepsakes she could see. Nothing personal in any direction she looked, except, there, half hidden on a shelf behind one of the books, a small river stone with something carved into it that she couldn't quite make out. Silas pulled out one of the chairs at the table. An invitation, she understood. She sat. He put a tin mug of coffee in front of her, strong, black, no ceremony, and sat across from her with his hands flat on the table and his eyes steady on hers. "Tell me," he said simply. So she told him. She told him about the last year, her father's illness, the way it had progressed quietly, while he went on teaching school and surveying land and pretending to the world and to her that nothing was wrong. She told him about the debts, discovered only after the funeral, borrowed money from 3 different men to cover the medical costs, a mortgage quietly defaulted, a supply account at the general store $200 in arrears. She told him about the house in Caldwell and how the bank had given her 60 days and how 50 of those days were already gone. Silas listened without interrupting. He held his coffee mug but didn't drink from it. He watched her face the way a man watches a river to understand its depth, not impolitely, just carefully, reading what was beneath the surface. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What did Thomas tell you?" he said. "Exactly. What words?" "He said to find you. He said to tell you Thomas Whitaker sent me." She paused. "He said he was finally calling the debt," Silas nodded slowly. He set his mug down. He looked at his hands. 12 years ago, he said, I was coming back from 3 years in the army. Not well. He said this plainly, without drama, a man reciting fact. I mean that in the physical sense, but also in other senses. I stopped in Caldwell, just passing through, no particular destination, which was the problem. I had 23 cents and a bad fever and a disposition that wasn't making me many friends. He glanced up at her. Your father found me sitting behind his schoolhouse. Don't ask me why I was there. I don't entirely know. He didn't ask either. He took me inside, sat me down, fed me, and when it was clear the fever was worse than I'd admitted, he put me in his spare room and kept me there for 11 days until I was well. Elena stared at him. He never told me that. He wouldn't have. A ghost of something crossed Silas's face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. He wasn't the kind of man who told people about the good he'd done. He was the kind of man who just did it. A pause. When I left, I told him if he ever needed anything at all, he should send for me. He waited 12 years, Elena said softly. He waited 12 years, Silas agreed. Another silence. Outside, the first snow of the evening had begun to fall. Elena could hear it against the cabin's single window, a sound like whispered secrets, like the world rearranging itself around a decision not yet made. She had promised herself she wouldn't say the next part unless she absolutely had to. She had to. He also said, she stopped, drew a breath. Don't hesitate. He said you needed a wife, and he said, he thought I needed a husband. He said it would solve things. She met his eyes directly because her father had raised her to meet things directly, however uncomfortable. I want you to know I'm not here to demand anything. I don't expect you to, I'm not asking you to, Stop, Silas said, not unkindly. She stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. Something was working behind those still gray-green eyes, some calculation or consideration that she couldn't see clearly but could feel the weight of. How much debt total? He said. She told him the number. He nodded. I have the land, he said. Clear title, no liens. I have a working homestead and enough timber contracts to carry us through winter if we're careful. What I don't have, he paused, is any particular skill at running the domestic side of things. Management, organization. Your father said you handled his accounts. Since I was 16, she said. Can you look at a ledger and tell me where money's being lost? I can look at a ledger and tell you where money is going and where it should be going and the 3 cheapest ways to fix the gap, she said. Then, despite everything, a small, helpless flicker of humor. I learned from a schoolteacher. He made everything into a lesson. Something happened in Silas Mercer's face. Not a full smile. She suspected full smiles were rare visitors in that face, but a genuine softening, a crack in the careful blankness that made him look suddenly and unexpectedly human. Your father was the best person I ever met, he said quietly. I owe him more than I can pay, but I can pay it to you, if you'll let me. He extended his hand across the table. Old-fashioned, deliberate. Clear terms, he said. Practical arrangement. You manage the homestead finances. I provide the property and the labor. The debts get settled. You get a roof and a future. No obligations beyond what we agree to. His eyes held hers without flinching. I won't pretend it's romantic. It isn't, but it's honest. And on this frontier, honest is worth more than romantic. Elena looked at his hand, large, calloused, a working man's hand bearing the history of every hard year he'd survived. She thought of the wolf on the trail behind her. She thought of $12 in her purse and 31 days before she had nothing. She thought of her father's voice. Find him. She shook Silas Mercer's hand. Clear terms, she said. Honest. They were married 4 days later in the front room of Sheriff Elias Crow's office in the nearby town of Ridgefall. A 3-hour ride west through snow that was becoming more serious about itself with each passing day. The sheriff served as witness. A circuit preacher passing through, a lean, wind-burned man named Brother Alcott, performed the brief ceremony with the professional efficiency of someone who had married people under more dramatic circumstances than these and expected to again. Elena wore her traveling clothes because they were her best. Silas wore a clean shirt that she noticed he'd pressed with some care, which told her something about him. She filed away without comment. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Afterward, Crow, a big, deliberate man with a lawman's watchful eyes and an unexpected gentleness in his manner, poured them each a small glass of whiskey and raised his own. "I've married folks in this office for 20 years, he said. "Some of them worked out and some of them didn't. The ones that worked," he paused, as if genuinely considering this, "they were always the ones that went into it honest about what they needed from each other. Congratulations to you both." They rode back to Frost Ridge in the dark, the snow falling steadily now, Silas slightly ahead on his big gray gelding and Elena keeping pace on Cora. They didn't talk much. The snow absorbed sound the way it absorbed everything, completely, without comment. Somewhere around the halfway point, her mare stumbled slightly on an icy patch of trail, and Elena's heart lurched before Cora caught herself. Without any visible signal, Silas's horse was suddenly beside her, Silas's hand briefly gripping Cora's bridle, steadying them both. "She favors her left front on ice," he said. "I'll look at it in the morning." "Thank you," Elena said. He nodded and eased his horse back to the trail. They rode on through the dark and the snow. It was not romantic. It was not anything like the stories Elena had read as a girl, the ones with declarations and transformed hearts, and the world rearranging itself around two people discovering each other. But it was honest. And for the first time since her father's last breath, Elena Mercer, now, she reminded herself, still strange in her mind, felt something that was not exactly peace and not exactly hope, but was perhaps the narrow path between them. She pulled her coat tighter and rode into the dark. The first 3 weeks were an education for both of them. Elena threw herself into the homestead's accounts with the focused, slightly desperate energy of a woman who needed to be useful badly enough to find usefulness everywhere she looked. Silas kept his records the way a man keeps records when record-keeping feels optional, which is to say, imperfectly. There were receipts stuffed into a tobacco tin, a ledger that tracked major expenses but ignored the smaller ones that, accumulated, amounted to a genuine drain. A timber contract she found at the bottom of a drawer, buried under surveying tools that she read twice and then sat holding in her hands with an expression Silas noticed from across the room. "What?" he said. "This contract," she said. "Do you know what lumber is selling for in Boise right now?" "Close enough." "You're getting paid 30% below market rate. Have been for..." She checked the date. 3 years. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Henderson's been buying my timber for 6 years. "Henderson has been underpaying you for timber for 6 years, Elena said, not unkindly. "There's a difference, and it's a difference of..." She did the calculation quickly in her head. Another thing her father had taught her. Roughly $240 over that period. Another silence. "You're certain?" Silas said. "I can show you every step," she said. He came and looked at the papers spread across the table. She walked him through it. He stood very still while she talked, looking at the numbers, and she could see something happening in his face. Not anger exactly, but the particular expression of a man realizing he's been taken advantage of by someone he'd trusted, which is its own particular species of wound. "All right," he said at last. "What do we do about it?" "We," Elena noticed. Not "what do I do?" "We." "You write to Henderson," she said, "with the correct market figures attached. You tell him you've reviewed the arrangement and you'd like to renegotiate starting with the next delivery. You're polite about it. You don't accuse him of anything, but you make it clear you now know the number and you won't be working below it." "And if he refuses?" "Then I write letters to the other 2 timber buyers operating in the territory right now, and we see which one wants your volume." She met his eyes. "You have the best timber access in this canyon. You've just never pressed the advantage." Silas looked at her steadily for a moment. "Write the letter," he said. She wrote it that evening, sitting at the table by lantern light, while Silas worked on a harness he was repairing by the stove. Henderson agreed to the new terms within a week. The correction added $31 to their monthly income, which, combined with the 3 other inefficiencies Elena had identified and addressed in the homestead accounts, changed their financial picture from precarious to, if not comfortable, at least stable. In the evenings, they fell into a pattern without discussing it. Silas cooked. He was a plain cook, efficient and unceremonious. And Elena set the table and managed the food stores, and they ate together across the worn wood of the table and sometimes talked about the practical matters of the homestead and sometimes didn't talk at all. and the silence between them was gradually becoming a different kind of silence than the one she'd arrived into. Not easy, exactly. Not warm, yet, but no longer guarded. He asked her questions occasionally, about her father, about what she'd done in Caldwell, about the books she'd read. This sparked longer conversations than anything else, because Silas, as it turned out, was a reader in the private, committed way of people who have spent long winters alone and discovered in books the only company that makes no demands. He had opinions about those books that surprised her. Sharp, considered opinions, arrived at through genuine thought rather than received wisdom. "You went to school somewhere," she said one evening, meaning it as an observation rather than a question. "2 years in Ohio," he said, "before the army." "What were you going to study?" A pause. He looked at his coffee. "Law," he said, which surprised her enough that she didn't immediately respond. He glanced up, reading her expression. "I know. I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say something," she considered. "I was going to say, my father would have found that interesting. He always said the frontier needed more honest lawyers." Something passed through Silas Mercer's face, grief, perhaps, or something near it, the way certain doors open unexpectedly onto old loss. "Your father," he said quietly, "was the kind of man who made you want to deserve the things he thought about you." The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, the November wind moved through the pines. Elena looked at this man, this stranger she had married for practical reasons, this scarred and careful and unexpectedly complicated man, and felt the territory between them shift slightly, like ice when the temperature changes. Not melting, not yet, but changing. She noticed the woman watching from the ridge on a Wednesday, in the middle of the 3rd week. Elena had been out near the split-rail fence tallying the livestock with a small notebook, breath pluming in the cold, when she happened to look up at the canyon rim and saw the figure, mounted, still, watching with a patience that felt deliberate. The distance was too great to make out features, but something about the quality of the attention, the utter stillness of it, raised the hair on the back of her neck. She mentioned it to Silas at dinner. His face did something careful and still. "Where exactly on the rim?" She described the position. "How long?" "At least 20 minutes that I saw, possibly longer." He ate 2 more bites before he spoke again. "Her name is Vivian Blackthorne," he said, as if the name were something he was setting on the table carefully, like a weapon being placed where both of them could see it. "She runs the biggest cattle operation in this part of the territory. Has for years." "She's watching your land," Elena said. "She's been watching my land for 4 years," Silas said. My land sits on the only water access on the east side of the canyon. Without it, her herds can't drink on the eastern range in dry summers. She's made 3 offers. I've declined all of them. And now she watches." "Now she watches," he agreed. He looked up from his plate. "I should have told you sooner. I didn't want to—" He stopped. "Frighten me?" Elena said. "Overwhelm you," he said. "You arrived with enough weight." It was, she realized, a kind thing, awkwardly expressed, as most kind things were in this man's vocabulary, but genuinely meant. "Tell me everything," she said. "About her, about the offers, about all of it." He told her about Vivian Blackthorne's methods, the way she'd acquired half her holdings through offers that arrived with implied consequences for refusal, the 2 families who'd sold after unexplained damage to their property, the water rights disputes she'd won through lawyers that the other ranchers couldn't afford to fight. He told her about the rider who'd cut 2 of his fence lines last summer. The one he couldn't prove had come from Blackthorne's operation, but knew had, the way a man knows things he can't prove when he's been paying attention for long enough. Elena listened. She filed everything. Her father had taught her this too. Listen to all of it, especially the parts that are hard to hear, because the parts people avoid telling you are usually the parts you need most. "She'll escalate," Elena said when he finished. "Now that there's someone here who might be managing things better. She was probably waiting for you to falter financially. When that doesn't happen, she'll find another way," Silas said. "Yes?" Elena looked at him steadily. "So we'd better be ready." He looked back at her. That look again. The one she was beginning to understand was his version of surprise, carefully managed. "All right," he said. They sat across the table in the lantern light while the Idaho winter pressed itself against the windows, and a woman named Vivian Blackthorne watched from a ridge and waited for her opportunity. And in that small spare cabin at the edge of Frost Ridge Canyon, two people who had married each other for practical reasons, who had made clear terms and no promises beyond survival, were doing something neither of them would have named yet. But they were, slowly and without ceremony, beginning to trust each other. And in a place where trust was rarer than water in August, that was something close to everything. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, buried beneath a feed invoice and a catalog from a hardware supplier in Boise, as if it were trying to hide among ordinary things. Elena found it when she was sorting the week's mail on the table, and she knew what it was before she opened it. Not from any particular premonition, but because the envelope was expensive, heavy cream stock with a wax seal pressed in deep burgundy, the kind of stationery that announced its sender's wealth before a single word was read. The return address said simply, Blackthorne Ranch, Frost Ridge Territory. She opened it with the small letter knife her father had given her, the one with the bone handle worn smooth from years of use, and she read it once quickly and then again slowly, the way her father had taught her to read anything that mattered. It was, on its surface, perfectly civil. Vivian Blackthorne wrote with the confidence of a woman who had never needed to shout because her money spoke at a volume that rendered shouting unnecessary. She expressed her congratulations on the recent marriage. News traveled fast on the frontier, Elena noted, and extended a cordial invitation for both Mr. and Mrs. Mercer to attend a dinner at Blackthorne Ranch the following Friday. To meet as neighbors, the letter said, and discuss matters of mutual interest regarding the canyon water access, which I believe we may find common ground upon if approached with open minds and goodwill on all sides. The handwriting was elegant. The language was gracious. Every word of it made Elena's skin crawl. She was still sitting with the letter when Silas came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots, bringing the cold in with him like a second presence. He took one look at her face and crossed to the table without stopping to hang up his coat. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it standing. His face did what his face always did with bad news, absorbed it quietly, going very still, the way deep water goes still when something heavy drops into it. She knows, Elena said. She's known since the day you arrived, Silas said. She has people in Ridgefall. She's moving faster than I expected. He set the letter down. She's testing us, wants to see what we do with the invitation. If we go, we're acknowledging her position, Elena said. We walk into her space, on her terms, and we sit at her table and listen to whatever she wants to offer us, and the entire territory sees that we came when she called. And if we don't go? Then we've refused a social overture, which on the frontier is considered an insult, and she gets to be the aggrieved party. Elena looked at the letter. She's clever. She's very clever, Silas agreed. She's been doing this for 15 years. They looked at each other across the table, and in that moment, Elena felt with a clarity she couldn't quite explain that this was the real beginning of something. Not the marriage, not the handshake, not the 11-minute ceremony in the sheriff's office, but this. Two people looking at the same problem and both knowing, without having to say it, that they were going to face it together. We go, Elena said. Silas raised an eyebrow. You want to walk into her house. I want to look at her, Elena said plainly. I want to watch how she moves and what she looks at and who she defers to in the room and who she dismisses. I want to hear her make her offer in person. She paused. And I want her to look at me and understand that I am not the vulnerability she thought she was getting when she heard about this marriage. A silence. Silas studied her face with that careful, assessing look she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he was revising something he'd previously thought. All right, he said, we go. Blackthorne Ranch was a 40-minute ride southeast, and it announced itself a mile before you arrived. First the fence line, white-painted and unbroken, the kind of fence that existed not for practical containment, but for the statement it made about ownership and order. Then the outbuildings, large and well-maintained, a small city of structures supporting the main operation. Then the house itself, set on a rise above the canyon with the calculated positioning of a building designed to be seen. 2 stories of dressed timber and river stone, with a broad porch and glass windows that caught the late afternoon light and threw it back at the world. Elena had dressed with care, her best wool skirt, the dark blue one, and a fitted jacket that had been her mother's, well made and still fine. She'd pinned her hair up with the silver pins her father had given her on her 20th birthday. She looked, she hoped, like a woman of competence rather than a woman of means, because competence was what she actually had, and she'd long since learned the value of leading with the truth. Silas had put on his good coat, the dark wool one he'd worn for their wedding. He'd shaved. He hadn't commented on her appearance, but when they mounted to ride out, he'd looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, evaluating perhaps, but not critically. More like a man recalibrating something. "You look like someone who's walked into negotiations before," he said. "My father took me to every land survey dispute he ever mediated," she said, "starting when I was 12. "Good," he said, and they rode out into the gray December afternoon. Vivian Blackthorne met them on the porch. She was not what Elena had constructed in her imagination during the ride over, and Elena recognized that the construction had been a mistake, the error of imagining a villain instead of a person, which always left you underprepared. Vivian Blackthorne was perhaps 50, handsome in the sharp-featured way of a woman who had always relied on intelligence more than softness, with silver-streaked dark hair pinned with ruthless efficiency and eyes that were dark brown and absolutely alert. She was dressed plainly but expensively, and she moved with the particular ease of a woman who had not been uncertain in her own domain for a very long time. She shook Silas's hand with the brisk competence of a business equal. Then she turned to Elena and looked at her, really looked at her, in the direct measuring way that Elena recognized because it was precisely what she herself was doing, and something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a recalibration of her own. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, "I've heard a great deal about you in a very short time." "I imagine you have," Elena said pleasantly. "Frost Ridge is a small territory." A beat. Then Vivian Blackthorne smiled. A real smile, or real enough that the difference didn't matter. "Come inside," she said. "It's too cold for the porch." The dinner was impeccable. The food was better than anything Elena had eaten in months, a fact she was careful not to let show on her face, because showing it would have been ceding a small advantage she didn't need to surrender. There were two other guests, a timber broker named Aldous Fenn, who had the quick eyes of a man permanently calculating his position, and the county land registrar, a colorless man named Stokes who spoke little and watched everything. Elena noted both men's presence and said nothing about it until later. The conversation over dinner moved with the surface courtesy of a chess game being played by people too polished to lunge. Ranching conditions, winter forecasts, the state of the Ridgefall trading post, the territorial governor's latest rulings on water rights. Vivian was an exceptional hostess, attentive and charming, and in complete control of every thread of conversation, weaving them where she wanted them to go with a skill that Elena genuinely admired even as she tracked it. After dinner, when the table was cleared, Vivian placed her hands flat on the linen cloth and looked at Silas with the expression of a woman moving from the social portion of the evening to the real business. "I'll be direct," she said. "I think we can all appreciate directness." "Please," Silas said. "The Eastern Water Access." She said it simply, as if naming something that had long since resolved into a settled fact in her mind. "My herds need it. Your land controls it. That's been a tension between us for years, and I'd like to resolve it cleanly." She named a number, a purchase price for the relevant parcel of Silas's land, with access rights to the creek for 3 seasons annually. It was a fair number, perhaps even a generous one. Elena recognized immediately that this was intentional. Vivian was not lowballing. She was making an offer that a reasonable person could not call exploitative, which meant that refusal would paint Silas as unreasonable rather than principled. It was, Elena thought, a beautifully constructed trap. "That's a thoughtful offer," Elena said before Silas could respond. Vivian turned to her, and in her eyes was the first genuine flash of something that might have been surprise. She had expected to negotiate with Silas. She'd perhaps expected his new wife to sit quietly and ornamentally. "We'd need to review the survey boundaries on that parcel," Elena continued, "and cross-reference them with the water rights registrations currently on file with the territorial office." She glanced at the land registrar, who had gone very still. "Mr. Stokes, you'd be the person to speak with about access to those records, I imagine." Stokes blinked. Yes, my office handles those filings." "Wonderful," Elena said warmly. "Then perhaps we can arrange a time to review the complete record before any decisions are made. I'd hate for either party to enter an agreement on incomplete information." The air in the room had changed. Elena could feel it, a subtle shift in pressure, like the atmosphere before a storm. Vivian Blackthorne was looking at her with an expression that had moved several degrees past social warmth into something cooler and more honest. And in that expression, Elena read a kind of unwilling recognition. "Of course," Vivian said. "I wouldn't want anything less than full information on the table." They rode home in the dark again, different dark this time, thicker, the cloud cover heavy enough to press down on the world. For the first mile, Silas said nothing, and Elena had learned enough about his silences to let this one run its course. "The registrar," he said finally. "He's hers," Elena said. "You're certain?" "He didn't look at you once during that dinner. He watched her. And when I mentioned the records, he looked at her before he answered me, checked to see what expression she was wearing." She paused. "Whatever documentation we find at the land office, we should verify against the territorial records directly. I'll write to Boise." Another silence, then, "You came into that room and you disarmed her." "I made her wait," Elena corrected. "That's different from disarming her. She's not disarmed. She searched for the right word. Reassessing. That worries you." "It should worry both of us," Elena said honestly. "A woman like that, when her first approach doesn't work, doesn't go home. She finds another way." She looked at the dark trail ahead. "We need to know what that way looks like before she uses it." December deepened into the kind of cold that the Idaho Territory seemed to produce as a point of pride, a cold with teeth and intentions that froze the creek solid by the third week of the month and coated the cabin windows with patterns of ice that were beautiful and completely indifferent to that beauty. Elena rose each morning before light to bank the stove and start coffee, not because anyone had assigned her this task, but because she was awake anyway, her mind running inventory before her eyes were fully open. The letter to the Territorial Records Office in Boise went out with the first mail rider. While they waited for a response, Elena turned her attention to the homestead with the same methodical focus she'd applied to the accounts. She reorganized the storage of the winter provisions, cataloging what they had and what would be needed and when, which allowed her to calculate exactly how much surplus they might have for trade by February. She identified two neighbors, the Haskell family 3 miles north and old Bert Calla, who worked a small claim east of the canyon, who were struggling worse than they were, and began quietly including them in certain trading arrangements that benefited all three households more than any of them could manage alone. Silas watched this without commenting directly, but she noticed that he began timing certain of his own work differently, cutting fence posts on days when the Haskells' older boy came to help, paying the boy a fair wage in trade goods rather than cash, because that was what would be most useful to that family. He didn't announce this generosity. He simply did it the way her father would have done it, and the recognition of that particular quality, the quiet, unassuming goodness of it, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected, in the part of her that had been keeping a careful professional distance from the man she'd married. They were sitting by the stove one evening, Elena mending a tear in one of Silas's work jackets while he read. She had borrowed 2 of his books already, and they had spent 3 evenings discussing them with an intensity that surprised them both. When he said, without looking up from his page, "Tell me about your mother." She looked up. It was the first personal question he'd asked that wasn't, directly or indirectly, about her father. "She died when I was 9, Elena said. Fever, in the spring." "Do you remember her clearly?" "I remember the way she laughed," Elena said. "She laughed easily. My father loved that about her. He used to say she laughed at the right things, which is rarer than people realize." She paused, needle still. "He never remarried. I used to wish he would when I was young because I thought he was lonely. When I got older, I understood that he wasn't lonely. He was just complete with what he had. Some people are like that." Silas lowered his book slightly. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stove. "I haven't—" He stopped, started again. "There was a woman, years ago, before the army, for a while during and after for a time." His voice was measured and even, reporting rather than confessing. "It didn't survive everything that happened. I don't think it was entirely her failing or mine. It was more that what I came back as didn't match the shape of what we'd been." Elena held the jacket in her lap and listened without speaking. This was rare, she understood. This was something being offered carefully, the way you offer something fragile. The Army did things to me, he said simply. Not dramatic things, not the kinds of things men talk about, just quiet things. Things that changed the dimensions of what I could tolerate and what I couldn't, what I needed and what felt impossible. He glanced at her briefly. I'm telling you because you should know what you married. I'm beginning to understand what I married, Elena said quietly. It's more than I expected. He looked at her for a moment. Then he raised his book again, but she saw the small, careful change in his face. Not quite the ghost of a smile, something different and less guarded. Something closer to relief. The letter from Boise arrived in the second week of January, and what it contained made Elena sit down slowly at the table and read it 3 times before she spoke. Silas, she said. He came from across the room. She handed him the letter. The Territorial Land Office had cross-referenced the water rights registrations for Frost Ridge Canyon and found an irregularity. A filing made 4 years earlier that purported to grant Blackthorn Ranch shared water access rights to the Eastern Creek, signed by the previous land registrar, whose name was not Stokes, but had been Stokes's predecessor. The signature had been notarized. The document appeared at first examination to be legitimate. It was not the document itself that was the problem. The problem was the date. The filing was dated March 14th, 1883, but the Territorial Surveyor's report from that same month, a public document filed separately, placed the survey team in a location 40 miles south of Frost Ridge on that date, which meant the property boundaries cited in the filing could not have been surveyed at the time the document claimed they were. Someone had filed a water rights claim using survey data that didn't exist yet at the time of filing. She's had a false claim on my water rights for 4 years, Silas said. His voice was very quiet. A claim she hasn't exercised yet, Elena said. She's been holding it, waiting for the right moment to produce it, probably if you ever formally refused to sell, and she needed legal grounds to force the issue. She would have presented that document in a territorial court, and I wouldn't have had the information to challenge it. He set the letter down. If you hadn't written to Boise, if you hadn't given me the freedom to look, Elena said. They looked at each other. The fire in the stove popped. Outside, the January wind moved through the canyon with a sound like distant arguments. What do we do with this? Silas asked. Elena thought of Vivian Blackthorn at her dinner table, handsome and composed and absolutely certain. She thought of the registrar Stokes checking his employer's face before answering a simple question. She thought of the Haskell family and old Bert Calla and every other small operation in this canyon that had bent or broken or quietly disappeared under the weight of 15 years of Vivian Blackthorn's patient, methodical pressure. We keep it, she said. For now. We keep it and we keep looking, because this isn't the only irregularity. This is just the one we found first. She looked at the letter. And we tell no one, not even Crow yet, not until we know the shape of the whole thing. Silas nodded slowly. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not anger exactly, because she was beginning to understand that anger was not his first response to things. Something harder and colder than anger. Purpose. All right, he said. We look. And they did. Through the deep dark of January, with the canyon locked in ice and the nights coming early and staying long, they built their case the way Elena's father had taught her to build arguments. Carefully, one verified fact at a time. Nothing assumed and nothing discarded. Everything written down in a ledger that Elena kept locked in the tin box under the floorboard beside the stove. They didn't yet know what was coming for them in the dark. But something was. The silence on the ridge above the cabin had changed in the past week. Silas felt it the way he felt most things, in his body before his mind caught up. A prickling alertness that he'd learned long ago not to dismiss. The horses were uneasy at night. Twice he'd found unfamiliar tracks in the snow near the hay barn, boot prints too large to be any of their neighbors. He mentioned it to Elena on a Thursday evening, and she looked at the map she'd drawn of the property and was quiet for a moment. How much of our winter supply is in that barn? She asked. Enough to matter, he said. She looked at the map. She looked at him. In her face was the clear, particular expression he'd come to recognize over these weeks. Not fear, but the face of a person who has correctly identified the nature of a danger and is already thinking past it to the response. "We should move some of it," she said. "Tonight." They spent 3 hours in the dark and cold, moving hay bales by lantern light from the barn to the smaller outbuilding, their breath-making clouds, neither of them talking much. At one point, Elena stumbled on an icy patch and Silas caught her arm without breaking stride, steadying her, and for a moment they were very close in the cold dark. Close enough that he could see the clarity in her eyes, and she could see the tension held carefully in his jaw. And something passed between them that neither of them named. Then they went back to work. By the time they came inside, stamping ice from their boots, it was past midnight. Elena made coffee. They sat across the table with the map and the ledger and the letter from Boise between them, planning for a danger they could feel but not yet see. The barn burned 6 days later. It started as a smell. Elena woke to it before her mind understood what it was. Something acrid and wrong threaded into the cold night air, cutting through the familiar scents of wood smoke and pine that she'd grown accustomed to in these weeks at Frost Ridge. She lay still for 2 seconds, cataloging the wrongness of it, and then her body was already moving before the word formed fully in her mind. Fire. Silas. She was across the cabin floor in 4 steps, her hand on his shoulder, and he came awake the way she'd noticed he always did. Instantly, completely, no soft border between sleep and readiness. A soldier's waking. He smelled it at the same moment she said it, and they were both pulling on coats and boots in the dark without lighting the lantern, moving by the faint orange glow that was already visible through the cabin window. That terrible, beautiful, wrong orange glow that painted the snow outside in shades of catastrophe. The hay barn was fully engaged when they pushed through the cabin door into the January night. The fire had taken the structure the way fire takes dry wood in winter, with a speed that felt almost deliberate, almost personal, as if the flames had been waiting for precisely this moment to demonstrate what they were capable of. The entire eastern wall was gone, replaced by a column of orange and yellow that rose 40 feet into the black sky and threw a heat Elena felt against her face from 30 yards away. The roar of it was immense. Not the soft roar of a contained fire, but the consuming, indifferent roar of something that has decided it owns the space it occupies. "The horses," Silas said, already moving toward the paddock. "I've got them." Elena ran for the fence. The 3 horses were wild-eyed and pulling at their leads, screaming in the particular register of terrified animals, and she spoke to them the way she'd learned to speak to Cora on Uncertain Trail. Low and continuous and absolutely certain, even when she wasn't, because animals read the steadiness of your voice more than the words. She got the first 2 loose and through the far gate while Silas arrived and took the third, the big gray gelding who was the most frightened, and between them they moved all 3 animals far enough from the heat to matter. Then they turned back to the barn. The hay inside, from what remained of it after their midnight precaution 6 days earlier, was fully alight, and there was nothing to be done about that. What they could do, and what they did for the next 2 hours in the brutal cold, was work the line between what was burning and what hadn't caught yet. Silas dragged a water trough on its side to form a break. Elena worked the hand pump at the well with a ferocity she didn't know she had in her arms, filling buckets and passing them to Silas, who doused the ground around the outbuilding where they'd moved the relocated supplies. The cold worked against them and briefly for them. The snow on the outbuilding's roof was their best ally, providing a wet barrier that the sparks couldn't immediately breach. They didn't speak. There wasn't language adequate to the work, and they'd been operating long enough in proximity to each other that speech had become, for practical things, sometimes unnecessary. He needed water. She saw it before he could turn to ask. She needed a second set of hands on the pump lever. He was there before she could call out. At some point, she didn't know when, time had collapsed into a sequence of buckets and cold and light and roar. The Haskell boy arrived on horseback, having seen the glow from 3 miles north, and then his father behind him, and then old Bert Calla on a mule that moved with the dignified haste of an animal that understood emergencies, even if it had opinions about the pace required. They joined the line without being asked, wordlessly, the way that people who live close to danger understand each other's needs without preamble. The barn burned to its foundations, but the outbuilding stood. The cabin stood. The horses were safe in Bert Calla's paddock a quarter mile down the trail, moved there in the second hour when it became clear the animals needed to be further from the smoke. When it was over, when the fire had consumed everything it was going to consume and settled into the sullen glow of its own wreckage, Elena sat down in the snow because her legs made the decision before she did. She was aware of cold in a distant, factual way, as if the temperature were information about someone else's body. Her hands were shaking. Soot had turned the lower half of her coat a uniform gray. Somewhere in the last 2 hours she'd lost the pin from her left boot, and the tongue had folded down and her foot was very cold, specifically in a way that was beginning to demand attention. Silas crouched in front of her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at her face, doing the assessment he always did, the one that evaluated damage before speaking about it. "You're not burned," he said. This seemed to be the thing he most needed to establish. "No," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her, flat and very tired. "Your hands." "I'm all right. The shaking is—" "I'm all right." He sat in the snow beside her instead of rising, which surprised her. And for a few minutes they simply sat there in front of the ruins of the barn, while Jeb Haskell and his boy and old Bert moved around the perimeter, making sure the hot spots at the edges were properly extinguished. The sky was beginning to suggest, very faintly and without commitment, the possibility of dawn somewhere far to the east. "This was not an accident," Elena said. "No," Silas said. "The tracks you saw near the barn, 3 nights ago." "Yes." She turned to look at him. In the orange remnant light of the dying fire, his face was all shadows and angles, and the particular expression she recognized now as his anger, not displayed, not performed, but held inward and very cold, far more frightening in its stillness than any shouted rage would have been. "She's telling us she can reach us," Elena said. "She's telling us we should be afraid." "Are you?" He looked at her steadily. "No. Neither am I." She looked back at the smoldering ruin. "I'm angry." They sat with that for a moment. 2 people in the snow in the January dark, with the smell of smoke in their clothes and the cold coming up through the ground, and the clear and shared understanding that they had just crossed from one kind of situation into another kind entirely. Jeb Haskell came to stand before them, holding his hat in both hands. He was a big, quiet man with a face built for weather and a manner built for truth. "Silas?" he said, and then, with a nod that carried real respect in it, "Mrs. Mercer." He paused. "This weren't lightning. Ground's been frozen solid for 3 weeks. And I found something near the east corner of the foundation." He held out his hand. In his palm was a short length of rope, scorched but recognizable, with a specific characteristic that Elena cataloged immediately. It was braided in a pattern, a 3/2 braid with a red strand worked in, the kind of distinctive cordage that wasn't general trade stock. "That's a supply rope," Silas said quietly. He'd gone very still in the specific way that meant recognition. "Blackthorn's operation uses that braid. I've seen it on their equipment at the Ridgefall trading post." Jeb Haskell's jaw tightened. He was a man who preferred not to say things he couldn't take back, and what he was clearly thinking was something he wanted to be sure about before saying. He looked at the rope, then at Silas. "I found it 6 feet from the east wall, buried a little under the snow like someone stepped on it running out." Elena reached out and took the rope from his hand carefully, the way you handle something you intend to preserve. "May I keep this?" Haskell looked at her, and in his eyes was the look she was beginning to recognize from the people of Frost Ridge, a careful, evaluating look that was not unfriendly, but that was measuring her, as the frontier always measured everyone, against the question of what they were actually made of. "It's your property it was found on," he said. She wrapped it in her handkerchief and put it in her coat pocket. They didn't sleep. The practical reality of the morning following a barn fire on a working homestead meant there was no space for sleep. Assessments needed to be made, decisions needed to be reached. The Haskell family and Bert Calla needed to be properly thanked, and their assistance somehow reciprocated within the dignity of frontier exchange, which meant not accepting charity as charity, but restructuring it as mutual aid in ways that let everyone keep their pride intact. Elena handled this with the skill her father had demonstrated hundreds of times, quietly, specifically, in terms of future arrangements rather than present debts. By mid-morning, when the light was gray and full, and the canyon walls were crusted with new ice, Elena sat at the table with the scorched rope and the letter from Boise and her growing ledger of irregularities, and thought carefully about what she needed. She needed proof that connected the rope to a specific person on Blackthorn's payroll. The rope's distinctive braid was circumstantial. Silas recognized the pattern, but recognition wasn't documentation. She needed a witness or a purchase record or something that placed an identifiable individual at or near the barn on the night in question. She also needed to move quickly, because Vivian Blackthorne would know by now that the fire hadn't accomplished what she'd intended. The barn was gone, yes, but not enough of their winter supply to force a retreat, because of the provisions they'd moved 6 days earlier. Vivian would recalibrate. The next move would come faster. "I need to go to Ridgefall," Elena said when Silas came in from assessing the foundation damage. He poured coffee and set a cup in front of her. "Today?" "Today. I need to speak to the man at the general store, Whitfield. He keeps purchase records." She held up the rope. "This braid pattern is distinctive enough that it comes from a specific supplier. If Blackthorne's operation buys it locally, Whitfield will have a record of it. And if someone purchased it recently in large quantity, that's a different kind of record." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You think there's a middleman, someone she hired?" "I think a woman like Vivian Blackthorne does not personally set fire to barns," Elena said. "She hires that done. And hired men buy supplies." She set the rope down. "Someone in Ridgefall knows who was working for her that night. Small towns always know. The question is who'll say it out loud and under what circumstances." He studied her across the table. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon with the heavy, purposeful sound of January at its fullest. "I'll come with you," he said. "I'd rather you didn't," she said, and before his face could form the objection, she continued, "Not because I need you to stay here, though the property shouldn't be empty, because in Ridgefall, questions asked by Silas Mercer are questions from the man whose barn just burned, which means they're accusations, and people get careful around accusations. Questions asked by his wife are," she paused, choosing, "curiosity, concern, a woman making conversation while her husband deals with the aftermath," a long silence. "You're going to ask these people for information in a way that doesn't sound like asking," Silas said. "My father mediated 37 land disputes in 18 years, Elena said. "I watched everyone. The first thing he taught me was that people tell you more when they don't realize they're being asked." Something moved through Silas's face. Admiration, she thought, though he would never use that word for it. Acknowledgement, at least. The particular look of a man who is recalibrating, again, what he's sitting across the table from. "Take Cora to the Haskells first," he said. "Have Jeb ride in with you as far as the main road." It wasn't the overprotective order it might have been from another man, she recognized. It was a practical safety measure delivered without condescension. She nodded, and he didn't belabor it. Ridgefall in January was a town turned inward. The false front buildings hunkered against the cold. The main street churned to frozen ruts, the population moving between warmth and necessity with the efficient humorlessness of people who take winter personally. Elena moved through it with purpose that she wore lightly, stopping at the post office first and then the feed merchant before she reached Whitfield's general store, because arriving at your actual destination after 2 preliminary stops looks like errand running rather than investigation. Warren Whitfield was a small man with an enormous mustache and the encyclopedic commercial memory of a merchant who understood that his real value to the community was knowing where everything was and who had bought it. He greeted Elena with the particular warmth reserved for the wife of a homesteader who paid his accounts promptly, which was the category Elena had carefully placed them in within the first 2 weeks of managing Silas's finances. She bought salt, thread, a small quantity of lamp oil, and a copy of the Territorial Gazette. And while Whitfield wrapped her purchases, she made conversation the way her father had made conversation, broadly, warmly, with genuine interest in the particulars of the other person's life, which opened most people like a key. It was while discussing the difficulty of winter supply chains that she produced the small piece of scorched rope. Oh, she'd found this in the yard after last night's terrible fire. Did he know where this kind of braided cord came from? It seemed like such an unusual pattern. She was trying to understand what had been stored in the barn that might have had this kind of rope on it. Whitfield examined the rope with the absorbed interest of a man who dealt in goods and knew their origins the way a naturalist knows species. "That's Caldwell braid," he said immediately. "See how the red strand is set? There's one supplier out of Caldwell produces it that way. Drummond's. Good heavy-duty line. I carry it." He reached under the counter and produced an identical coil, unscorched. "Don't move much of it. It's specialty stock, costs more than the standard cordage. Who uses it locally? Elena asked, genuinely curious sounding. Whitfield thought about it with the slight frown of a man consulting a mental ledger. Blackthorn Operation orders it twice a year. They like it for the livestock tie-downs. It's got good resistance to the cold, and he paused, something shifting in his expression. Well, man came in about 2 weeks back, bought 2 coils of it, which I thought was unusual for a single purchase. Paid in cash, which is less usual than you'd think around here. Do you know him? Elena asked. Seen him around, Whitfield said, and now his voice had acquired a carefulness, a slight pulling back that told her he was beginning to connect something. Works for Blackthorn's outfit on and off. Name of Cutter, Tom Cutter. He said the name and then looked at her, and she could see him arriving at the question, why is she asking? What does this rope mean to her? What am I suddenly part of? And she gave him the most honest answer available, because her father had also taught her that honesty, deployed carefully, was the most disarming tool in any conversation. My barn burned last night, she said quietly. We lost the structure. We'd moved most of the supply, so we'll survive the winter, but I'd like to know what happened. Whitfield looked at the rope in her hand. He looked at her face. He was a small-town merchant, not a brave man by nature, not a man looking for conflict, but he was also, she judged, she had learned to make these judgments watching her father work, a man with a functional conscience that had been uncomfortable for some time. Tom Cutter, he said again, more slowly. He's been running errands for Blackthorn's outfit going on 3 years, mostly things that don't get written down. Thank you, Elena said. She paid for her purchases and left before he could reconsider. The ride back to Frost Ridge took her past the sheriff's office in the center of town, and she stopped there on an instinct that felt like her father's voice in her ear. You have enough now, Elena. Don't wait for more. Elias Crow was at his desk when she came in, a large, steady man who smelled of coffee and wood polish, and the particular calm of someone who had been dealing with human disorder for long enough to have made a kind of peace with it. He looked up at her with an expression that shifted from courtesy to concern when he registered the state of her coat. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I heard about the barn. I was going to ride out tomorrow. Today would be better, she said, and sat down across from him and put the scorched rope on his desk and told him about Tom Cutter. Crow listened the way good lawmen listen, completely, without interrupting, his face giving nothing away but his eyes taking everything in. When she finished, he picked up the rope and looked at it for a moment. You moved your winter supply before the fire, he said. It was not quite a question. We'd noticed unfamiliar tracks near the barn, she said. We took precautions. Something moved in Crow's eyes. A professional respect, she thought, for the kind of thinking that anticipated trouble rather than merely responding to it. And the land records issue, he said. The filing from 1883. She stared at him. You know about that? I've been a lawman in this territory for 20 years, Crow said, with the slight heaviness of a man who has known things he couldn't yet prove. I know a great deal about a great many things. He set the rope down. I've been waiting for someone to bring me something I could act on. Elena looked at this man, this steady, patient man who had been holding his own careful vigil, and felt something shift in the architecture of what she'd understood about Frost Ridge Canyon. They had not been alone in this. They had been perhaps the piece that was missing from a structure Crow had been building for longer than either she or Silas had known. What do you need from us? She asked. Everything you have, he said. The letter from Boise, the ledger, the rope, your account of what Whitfield told you. He met her eyes directly. And I need you to understand that when this moves, and it will move fast once it starts, there may be a period where you are more exposed, not less. Before she's stopped, she'll know she's being stopped. I understand, Elena said. She rode back to Frost Ridge in the long blue light of the January afternoon, the canyon walls rising around her, the cold settling into her bones with the permanence of something that had decided to stay. She thought about Vivian Blackthorn in her 2-story house on the rise, all that composed intelligence turned toward a single purpose for 15 years. She thought about Tom Cutter and his cash purchase and the rope that had burned while the barn burned. She thought about Elias Crow and his 20 years of patient waiting. She thought about Silas and the moment in the snow at 3 a.m. when he'd sat beside her instead of above her, and what that choice had meant. She was still thinking about him when she came over the ridge and saw the cabin below. The good thick logs of it, the smoke rising from the stove chimney, the yellow light in the window that meant he'd lit the lamp against the falling dark. Such a small thing. A light in a window. The evidence of someone waiting. She hadn't had that in a very long time. She urged Cora down the trail and let herself feel, quietly and without making too much of it, that the light in the window was for her. Silas had supper on the table when she came through the door. It was a simple thing: venison stew, bread he'd made himself in the cast-iron pan, coffee already poured, but the fact of it stopped her in the doorway for a moment in a way she hadn't expected. She'd been gone since mid-morning, moving through cold and smoke smell and the particular alertness of someone operating in enemy territory, and she'd come home to warmth and food and a man who had made both without being asked, without comment, without the performance of generosity that made generosity feel like a transaction. She sat down and told him everything before she ate a single bite, because that was the right order of things, and they both knew it. He listened the way he always listened, completely, with his hands still and his eyes steady and his whole considerable attention brought to bear on her words rather than on what he was going to say next. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Crow's been building a case," he said. "For years, I think," Elena said. "We gave him what he was missing." "You gave him what he was missing." He said it plainly, without the elaborate qualifications some men would have added, and she understood that this was how he gave credit. Directly, without ornament, in the same tone he used for everything else that was simply true. "We moved the supplies 6 days ago," she said. "That was you. That was both of us." She looked at her stew. Outside, the January dark had fully arrived, pressing against the cabin windows with the particular weight of deep winter nights in the canyon, and the stove radiated its steady, indifferent heat. And for a moment the world contracted to just this: the table, the light, the man across from her, and the knowledge that tomorrow something was going to begin moving that they couldn't entirely control. "Crow said we'll be more exposed before it's over," she said, "while it's moving." "I know," Silas said. "That doesn't concern you." It wasn't really a question. She'd learned enough about him by now to know that concern, for Silas Mercer, was not something that lived on his face. It lived in the extra care he took with the rifle before bed, in the way he checked the window latch twice each evening, in the fact that he'd slept lighter since the fire, waking at sounds she couldn't even hear. Concern, in this man, expressed itself as preparation rather than worry. "It concerns me," he said. "I just don't find it useful to dwell on it." She smiled at that, a small, private smile aimed at her bowl. And he caught it, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it sometimes did. The almost smile that she'd begun to understand was his full version of what other men made into a broad grin. They ate in the comfortable quiet that had become the texture of their evenings, and neither of them said anything more about Vivian Blackthorne, because there was nothing more to say tonight, and some silences are the most honest communication available. Crow moved faster than she'd expected. Within 48 hours of her visit to his office, Tom Cutter was located at a boarding house in Ridgefall, where he'd been staying since 2 days before the fire, a fact that the boarding house register established with the bureaucratic indifference of written records, which don't know they're incriminating anyone and therefore do it perfectly. Crow brought 2 deputies and served a formal interview request with the quiet, implacable authority that Elena would come to associate with him. A man who had decided something was going to happen and had accordingly arranged for it to happen, without drama or announcement. Tom Cutter was not, as it turned out, a man built for the sustained pressure of official inquiry. He was a hired hand in the practical sense, competent at tasks, loyal to whoever was currently paying him, but without the deeper ideological commitment to Vivian Blackthorne's project that would have sustained him through real consequences. He held out for most of one afternoon. By evening, Crow had a signed statement. Elena learned this from Crow himself, who rode out to Frost Ridge Canyon on a Thursday morning with his collar turned up against the cold and his face arranged in the particular expression of a man delivering news he has been waiting a long time to deliver. They sat around the cabin table, Crow, Silas, and Elena, with coffee between them and the winter light coming pale through the window, and Crow laid out what Cutter had told him with the methodical precision of a man assembling a structure that needed to bear weight. Cutter had been hired through an intermediary, a ranch foreman named Bascom, who handled Blackthorn's less documented arrangements, to surveil the Mercer property and report on its vulnerabilities. When the barn was identified as the target that would cause maximum damage with minimum traceable involvement, Cutter had been paid $200 in cash to set the fire on a specific night, using materials purchased with that same cash, and to be 40 miles away by morning. He had not been 40 miles away. He'd been at the Ridgefall boarding house, which was perhaps the most expensive mistake of Tom Cutter's professional life. "The foreman Bascom," Elena said when Crow finished. "Does his statement reach him?" "Directly," Crow said, "and Cutter's account of his instructions goes up from Bascom to Blackthorn herself. It's not documentary, there's no written order, but Cutter's testimony establishes a chain of direction that a territorial court will find compelling, particularly alongside everything else." "The land filing," Silas said, "which I've now formally referred to the Territorial Land Authority in Boise," Crow said, "along with the surveyor's date discrepancy you identified." He looked at Elena with the steady, level gaze of professional acknowledgement. "That piece, the survey dating, is what transforms a property dispute into a fraud case. It's the difference between a civil matter and a criminal one." Silence settled over the table. Elena looked at her coffee and thought about the document she'd found in the Territorial Archive response. The small clerical anomaly that she'd almost missed on the first reading and caught only on the second because her father had taught her to read everything twice and the second time slower. "She'll know," Elena said. "Bascom will tell her, or someone else will. She'll know that Cutter talked." "Yes," Crow said. "How long before the Territorial Authority moves?" 3 weeks, perhaps 4. "These things take the time they take." He paused. "In the interim, I'll have a deputy make daily passes by your property line. It's the most I can offer officially." It wasn't enough, and all 3 of them knew it, but Elena nodded as if it were, because Crow was doing what he could within the architecture of his authority, and acknowledging the inadequacy out loud would help no one. After Crow left, she and Silas stood on the cabin porch in the cold. An unusual thing, standing on the porch together, they rarely stood still outside in January, and watched his horse pick its way down the snow-packed trail until the tree line took him. "She has lawyers," Silas said. "Several," Elena agreed. "Good ones, I imagine. If she moves to file an injunction against the land authority proceeding, delays the territorial review, she buys time and we lose momentum," Elena finished. "Yes, I've been thinking about that." She'd been thinking about it since the ride home from Ridgefall, actually. It had been running beneath everything else, a quiet, persistent problem, the way certain problems run beneath the surface of thought until you're ready to look at them directly. "My father's land survey records. He worked this territory for 6 years before he died. He would have surveyed near Frost Ridge at some point. He surveyed the entire northwestern corridor for the Territorial Commission in 1881 and 1882. Silas turned to look at her. "If he surveyed anywhere near the Blackthorn water access parcel during that period," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "his personal records would show the actual boundary positions and dates. His records were meticulous. I know because I helped him keep them from the time I was 14. He used a double entry system for survey documentation, the original field notes, and a clean copy kept separately." She paused. "When I packed his belongings from the house in Caldwell, I took everything. It's in the trunk I brought here." Silas was very still. "You haven't looked through it." "I haven't been ready to look through it," she said honestly. "But I think I need to now." She went through the trunk that evening, while Silas sat with a book he wasn't reading, and the cabin was quiet except for the stove and the wind and the occasional sound of paper being carefully turned. Her father's survey records were exactly as she'd kept them in her memory. Meticulous, systematic, dated with the scrupulous precision of a man who understood that in land documentation, exactness was integrity. Field notes in his small, careful handwriting, clean copies in a separate folder, each survey dated, initialed, and cross-referenced. She found the Frost Ridge Canyon survey in the 3rd folder. September 1882. 14 pages of field notes and a clean copied summary stamped with the Territorial Commission's mark. The survey covered the eastern canyon wall, the creek access points, and the property boundaries of every parcel in a 3-mile radius, including, documented in her father's precise hand with the date September 14th, 1882, the water access boundary of what was at that time a smaller cattle operation on land that would eventually become Blackthorn Ranch. The fraudulent filing claimed survey data from March 1883. Thomas Whitaker's records showed the actual boundary positions from September 1882, and those positions did not, emphatically, measurably, in numbers that could be verified against the geography itself, support the water access claim that the 1883 filing had manufactured. Her father had surveyed the truth 6 months before someone had forged a document claiming to supersede it. Elena sat with this for a long time, the papers in her hands, her father's handwriting familiar as her own heartbeat, and felt something that was grief and gratitude so tangled together that she couldn't separate one from the other. He had done this work 38 years ago in the meticulous way he did all his work, because being careful was simply who he was, without any knowledge of what it would mean to anyone, certainly without knowledge that it would mean something to her, here, in a cabin at the edge of a canyon in the middle of a winter he hadn't lived to see. Elena. Silas's voice was quiet. She looked up. Her eyes were wet, she realized. She wasn't embarrassed about it. I found it, she said, and held up the folder. He crossed to the table and sat beside her. Not across from her, beside her. And she showed him the pages. He read slowly, following the survey notations with a finger, and she watched his face as he understood what he was reading, watched the careful stillness of it shift into something she'd rarely seen there. Not excitement, because Silas Mercer did not traffic in excitement, but a deep, settled recognition, the look of a man seeing a long-running injustice arrive at the possibility of its correction. "Your father," he said. "Yes," she said. "He saved my life twice, apparently." He said it quietly, looking at the pages. "He would have said he just did his job both times," Elena said. Silas looked at her. Close, because they were sitting beside each other rather than across the table's width, closer than they usually occupied in the cabin's space, and she was aware of this with a portion of her attention that was separate from the practical urgency of everything else. His eyes, in the lamplight, were darker than their usual gray-green, a winter creek color she'd always thought, but tonight more like deep water, something with depth she hadn't finished understanding. "He raised someone remarkable," Silas said. Simply, plainly, the way he said the things he meant. She held his gaze for a moment that lasted longer than practical conversation required, and then she looked at the papers and said, with a steadiness she had to locate carefully, "I need to get this to Crow and to Boise both. Tomorrow." "I'll ride with you," he said. "Don't argue." "I wasn't going to," she said, which surprised them both slightly. They rode to Ridgefall in the morning with the survey documents wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, and Elena left copies, carefully made by hand that same evening, with Crow, and sent the originals by express mail to the Territorial Land Authority with a formal cover letter citing the specific discrepancies between her father's 1882 field records and the 1883 filing. She wrote the letter in the precise, unornamented legal language her father had taught her, citing statute numbers she'd looked up in one of Silas's law books. The 2-year-old set of territorial codes she'd found on his shelf and had been quietly reading for 3 weeks. Silas watched her write the letter at Crow's desk with an expression she didn't see because her back was to him. Crow saw it, though. The sheriff was a perceptive man, and what he saw on Silas Mercer's face while his wife wrote a legal brief from memory in a borrowed office in 15 minutes flat was something that Crow, a man who had watched people for 20 years, recognized clearly and said nothing about. What happened next happened quickly, because the machinery of consequence, once properly set in motion, tends toward momentum. Vivian Blackthorn's lawyers filed an injunction 4 days later, exactly as Elena had predicted, seeking to delay the territorial review on grounds of procedural irregularity. It was a well-constructed filing, expensive legal work designed to create enough procedural confusion to buy months of delay. Under ordinary circumstances, it would likely have succeeded. Thomas Whitaker's 1882 survey records were not ordinary circumstances. The Territorial Land Authority, presented with primary source documentation from a commissioned surveyor predating the disputed filing by 6 months, declined the injunction on the grounds that the fraud question superseded procedural disputes. The review proceeded, and when the review proceeded, it did not stop at the water rights filing. Elena had told Crow, in their first real conversation, that the fraudulent filing was probably not the only irregularity. She'd been right. Once the Territorial Authority began pulling threads, the fabric of Vivian Blackthorne's land portfolio began to unravel in the specific way of things constructed from deception rather than solid material, quickly, and in multiple places simultaneously. 3 additional disputed filings were identified within the first week of formal review. 2 of them involved properties whose original owners had sold under circumstances that now looked considerably less voluntary than they had at the time. A water rights claim in the Southern Canyon that had displaced old Bert Calla from his primary grazing land in 1884 was found to rest on surveying data that shared the same anomaly as the Mercer filing, coordinates that couldn't have been established at the stated date. Crow arrested Bascom, the ranch foreman, on a Wednesday. The arrest was quiet and efficient, the way Crow did things, with 2 deputies and paperwork already prepared and the particular economy of a man who had been waiting to do this specific thing for a long time and didn't intend to make a production of it now that the moment had arrived. Vivian Blackthorne was served with formal territorial fraud charges on a Friday. Elena learned this when Crow rode out to tell them, and she was in the kitchen garden, a frozen patch of ground she'd been planning on paper for 3 weeks, sketching out what she'd plant in spring when the ground gave. And she stood up from her crouching with her gloved hands dirty and listened to Crow's carefully neutral voice deliver the news. And she felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph. She'd thought it might feel like triumph when this moment came. Instead, it felt like the slow release of something she'd been holding tightly for a long time. A breath let out finally, the particular relief of putting down a heavy thing. "She'll fight it," Elena said. "Every step," Crow agreed. "She has resources, and she'll use them." He paused. "But the survey records changed the landscape, if you'll forgive the expression. A fraud case with primary documentation is a different animal from a fraud case built on circumstantial evidence and testimony." He looked at her steadily. "Your father's records are going to be cited in this proceeding for years." Elena looked at the frozen garden. She thought about Thomas Whitaker riding the Eastern Canyon in September 1882 with his surveying equipment and his careful notebooks, documenting the world as it actually was, because that was the only way he knew to document anything. "He'd have found that annoying," she said. "He didn't do work to be famous for it." Crow smiled, a real smile, the kind that changed his whole face briefly. "No, he did it to be accurate." He put his hat back on. "Which is why it matters." Silas had been standing slightly behind her during this conversation, and when Crow rode away, he came to stand beside her and looked at the frozen garden plot she'd been planning. "What were you drawing out?" he said. "Kitchen garden," she said. "For spring. I was thinking, tomatoes along the south-facing wall where the heat reflects. Beans on the fence line. Squash in the corner because it spreads and doesn't care how cold the nights were before." She paused. "Root vegetables in the center. Things that last." He looked at the sketch she'd made in the dirt before Crow arrived, still visible in the frozen ground. "You've been planning this since December," he said. It was an observation, not a question. "Since November, actually," she said. "Since the first week I was here." He turned to look at her, and she met his eyes. And what was between them in that moment was a year's worth of things that hadn't been said yet, accumulated in the space between 2 people who had both learned by different difficult routes to be careful with the things they felt. The frozen garden between them, the canyon walls, the pale February sky with its suggestion, very faint and still entirely tentative, of a sun that had not forgotten how to have warmth in it. "Elena," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. "I don't think you do," he said. "I want to say it." She waited. "I didn't know what this was going to be," he said slowly, in the way of a man choosing words as precisely as he chose anything else, because precision was how he honored things that mattered. "When you rode up to this fence, when I opened that door and saw you standing there with Thomas Whitaker's name in your mouth and your whole life in a saddlebag, I thought I was repaying a debt." He looked at the garden. "I've been understanding for some time now that I was wrong about that." "What were you doing instead?" she asked quietly. He looked at her. The almost smile, and then beyond it, past the careful management of expression that was his habitual armor, something she'd seen building for weeks and hadn't let herself entirely acknowledge, because acknowledging it felt like reaching for something she hadn't fully earned yet. "Starting over," he said. "I think I was starting over, without knowing it." The February wind moved through the canyon, lifting a fine spray of snow from the fence rail between them, and Elena Mercer looked at this man, this scarred, careful, surprisingly deep man she had married for practical reasons 4 months ago, and understood with the quiet certainty of something finally arriving at its correct place that she was not going to be afraid of this. "So was I," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the gesture as direct and unadorned as everything else about him. And they stood in the frozen garden in the pale February light, while somewhere in a 2-story house on a canyon rise, the world Vivian Blackthorne had built from deception continued its quiet, inevitable collapse. The hand-holding lasted exactly as long as the cold allowed, which was not very long, but it was enough. They went inside without discussing what had been said in the garden, because some things, once said, don't require the architecture of further conversation to stand. They simply exist, solid and weight-bearing, like the good log walls of the cabin around them. Elena made coffee. Silas fed the stove. The ordinary choreography of the evening resumed around something that had quietly and permanently changed within it, and neither of them felt the need to name the change out loud again. What followed in the next several weeks was, in its own way, more difficult than what had come before. Vivian Blackthorne did not collapse gracefully. Elena had not expected her to. A woman who had built an empire through 15 years of patience and strategic ruthlessness did not become a different kind of person when the walls began coming down. She became a more concentrated version of herself, bringing every remaining resource to bear on slowing what she couldn't stop. Her lawyers filed 14 separate motions in the territorial court over the course of 6 weeks. She called in favors from men in Boise whose names Elena didn't know, but whose influence was real enough that 2 of the motions were granted, buying delays that stretched the formal proceeding into March. Each delay cost something. Not financially. Elena had the homestead accounts running well enough now that the winter, for all its damage, had not broken them. What the delays cost was the steadier thing, the sustained alertness required when you know someone capable of hiring arsonists is still free and still angry. Silas returned to sleeping lightly. Elena found herself cataloging sounds in the night in a way she hadn't done since the weeks before the fire. They didn't speak about this directly, but they managed it together without discussion. Silas checking the property line each evening before dark, Elena maintaining the second set of financial records in the locked tin box as insurance against any attempt to challenge their documentation. Both of them moving through the days with the specific, careful attention of people who have learned that danger announces itself in small things before it arrives in large ones. The community around them had shifted, and this was something Elena noticed in the accumulation of small gestures rather than any single event. Jeb Haskell and his boy had come the night of the fire without being called. Old Bert Calla had housed their horses without being asked. Warren Whitfield at the general store had told the truth when the easier thing would have been silence. These were not dramatic acts of solidarity. They were the quiet, unglamorous choices of ordinary people deciding, each in their own private calculation, that enough was enough. In early March, when the territorial proceeding entered its most consequential phase, and the Blackthorne land records were formally submitted to judicial review, the canyon communities began attending the proceedings in Ridgefall in numbers that surprised even Crow. Ranchers and homesteaders and small merchants who had bent under Vivian Blackthorne's pressure for years, who had sold land they hadn't wanted to sell or surrendered water rights that had cost them dearly, came to sit in the territorial courtroom's hard wooden benches and watch the machinery of consequence work its slow, inevitable way through the evidence. Elena attended every session. Silas attended most of them, though he was still rebuilding the barn, a project that had consumed his days since February, working with the methodical, unhurried competence of a man who understood that good construction could not be rushed, and that a barn built too quickly in the cold would not stand the next winter. He had refused help with it, initially, until the Haskell family arrived one morning with tools and 2 additional hands, and the particular stubbornness of neighbors who had decided the matter was settled regardless of his opinion. And he had looked at Jeb Haskell for a long moment and then nodded once and handed the man a hammer. It was in the 3rd week of the proceedings that Vivian Blackthorne made her final significant move, and Elena had the retrospective clarity to recognize afterward that she should have anticipated its specific shape, even if she'd anticipated its general category. The move was not physical this time. It was a legal filing. a challenge to the admissibility of Thomas Whitaker's 1882 survey records on the grounds that the records had been produced by an interested party, specifically the late father of the current defendant's wife. The filing argued that the survey records constituted self-interested testimony rather than independent documentation, and petitioned the court to exclude them from the evidentiary record. Elena read the filing in Crow's office on a Tuesday morning and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Genuine fear of a specific and functional kind, the fear of a person who has identified a real threat to something real. "It has merit," she said. Her voice was steady because she needed it to be. Crow, across the desk, nodded slowly. "Technically, yes. The challenge has procedural basis." He paused. "It won't succeed in my assessment, but it will create delay, and it may require the territorial court to formally qualify the records, which means calling expert witnesses on surveying methodology, which means more time," Silas said from beside her. He was reading the filing over her shoulder. "Weeks, possibly months," Crow said. Elena set the filing down. She thought about her father's survey records, the clean, careful pages, the double entry system, the precise dates and notations. She thought about what her father had taught her about the integrity of documentation and the ways that integrity could be demonstrated rather than merely asserted. "The Territorial Commission stamp," she said suddenly. Crow looked at her. "Pardon? My father's surveys, the ones he conducted for the Territorial Commission in 1881 and 1882, they carry the Commission's official stamp on every summary page. That stamp is a commission record. The Commission maintains its own archive of every survey it commissioned. The Frost Ridge survey will be in their archive in Boise independently as a commission document." She looked at Crow directly. "If the Territorial Commission produces their own copy of the 1882 survey from their own archive, a copy that has nothing to do with me or my father's personal records, the interested party argument collapses. You're no longer looking at a document produced by a family member. You're looking at a government commission's official record." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room catches up to something. Crow leaned back slowly in his chair. "The Commission archive in Boise. My father submitted copies of every commission survey to the territorial office within 30 days of completion. He was meticulous about it. He felt the commission record was the most important copy because it was beyond question." She met Crow's eyes. "Write to the Commission archive today. Request the official copy of the Frost Ridge Canyon Survey, September 1882, filed under Surveyor Thomas Whitaker." Crow was already reaching for paper. "If it's there, it's there," Elena said with a certainty that came not from hope, but from knowledge of her father's habits, which were as reliable as any fixed point she'd ever known. "He never missed a submission in 20 years, not once." The Commission archive responded in 11 days, which for a government institution in 1888 was something close to miraculous and probably reflected the level of official attention the Blackthorn proceedings had begun to attract in territorial administrative circles. The official copy of the Frost Ridge Canyon Survey, September 1882, commissioned by the Idaho Territorial Land Authority and filed by Surveyor Thomas Whitaker on October 8, 1882, arrived in Ridgefall by express courier in a sealed government envelope. It was identical, in every particular, to the copy Elena had found in her father's trunk. The boundary positions, the creek access measurements, the dated field notes. Every number matched, down to the decimal points her father had carried to the fourth place, because he felt that less precision than that was an invitation to dispute. The admissibility challenge was denied. The proceedings resumed with the full evidentiary record intact, and what followed over the next 2 weeks was less a battle than a dismantling. The systematic, documented exposure of 15 years of fraudulent land acquisition, presented in the careful, methodical language of legal evidence that made it more devastating rather than less for its lack of drama. 4 disputed property filings, 2 forged water rights claims, a pattern of directed intimidation establishing Bascom's role as the operational arm of Blackthorn's extra-legal activities, with Tom Cutter's testimony providing the specific thread that connected the organizational direction to the barn fire. Bascom received a formal criminal finding. Tom Cutter, whose cooperation had been instrumental and whose role had been instrumental rather than directorial, received a lesser finding with terms that required his departure from the territory within 30 days. Vivian Blackthorne's legal team negotiated furiously through the final days of the proceeding, and the result, announced on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of March, with the canyon's first real suggestion of spring light coming through the courthouse windows, was a formal consent decree requiring the dissolution of all fraudulently obtained land claims, the return of water rights to their original holders where possible, and compensated settlement where return wasn't feasible, and Vivian Blackthorne's personal acknowledgement of the fraud findings as a condition of avoiding criminal prosecution. She signed the consent decree in the courthouse on a Friday morning. Elena was there. She watched Vivian Blackthorne move through the room with the same composed precision she'd displayed at her dinner table 4 months earlier, and she thought about the quality of a certain kind of pride, the kind that doesn't break but simply relocates, withdrawing from a lost field to await the next opportunity. She thought about how dangerous a person like that remained, even in defeat. She thought about it, and then she let it go. Because what she could not change was not worth the weight of continued carrying. Vivian Blackthorne signed the decree. She collected her lawyers with the efficiency of a woman who had somewhere else to be and had already begun calculating how to be there. She passed Elena in the courthouse doorway on her way out, and for a moment, just a moment, their eyes met. There was no speech, no final exchange. Vivian Blackthorne looked at Elena Mercer with an expression that contained, in equal and unresolved measure, something like fury and something that Elena could only read as a bleak, unwilling respect. Then she moved past her and out the door and into the March morning and out of Frost Ridge Canyon's life. By April, she had sold the ranch to a cattle operation out of Oregon and departed the territory entirely. Spring came to Frost Ridge Canyon the way spring always comes to high country. Tentatively, in the manner of something that has been burned before and intends to be careful this time. The creek thawed in early April and ran clear and cold through the canyon. The ponderosas began showing their new growth at the tips of every branch, that particular bright green that exists nowhere else in nature, so vivid it seems almost aggressive about its own aliveness. Elena planted the kitchen garden on a Tuesday in the second week of April, working the bed she'd planned since November with the focused satisfaction of a person finally executing something long and carefully considered. The tomatoes went against the south-facing wall. The beans went on the fence line. The squash went in the corner with the sprawling, cheerful indifference to boundary that she'd promised Silas it would have, which had made him laugh. A real laugh, one of the 3 or 4 she'd heard from him in 5 months, each one worth noting. He came out from the nearly completed barn at mid-morning and crouched at the edge of the garden bed, watching her work. "The root vegetables are in the wrong section," he said. She looked up. "They're not in the wrong section. The drainage on that end runs north. Root crops want south drainage in this soil." She sat back on her heels and looked at the bed and then, with the honesty that she tried to bring to all things, acknowledged that he was correct. "I had them there because I wanted them in the center." "You can have them in the center of the corrected layout," he said, with a complete absence of self-congratulation that she had come to understand was one of his most fundamental qualities. "Help me move them then," she said. He came into the garden and knelt beside her, and they rearranged the root vegetable section together in the April morning, their hands in the same cold dirt, working in the comfortable parallel that had become the texture of their shared life. Not the romantic image of 2 people looking at each other, but the real thing. 2 people looking at the same problem and solving it together without fuss. When it was done, he didn't immediately stand up. He stayed kneeling beside her with his hands resting on his knees and looked at what they'd done, at the garden taking its shape in the Idaho spring, and then looked at her. "I want to say something," he said. "You said something in February," she said softly. "You said it clearly. I want to say more." She waited. A robin had appeared on the fence rail, early for them, optimistic about the season, and was making its case for the morning with considerable vocal confidence. "I spent a long time," Silas said slowly, "believing that the things the Army did to me were the permanent dimensions of what I was, what I could be." He paused. "Not dramatically. I wasn't broken in the way men sometimes are. It was quieter than that. I just couldn't imagine being more than what I'd become. A man alone on a piece of land, surviving, getting through winters." He looked at the garden. "I had stopped being able to imagine spring." Elena was very still. "You came through my door in November," he said, and by January I was looking at frozen ground and thinking about what would grow in it. He met her eyes. I don't know exactly when that changed. I know you were the reason. She reached over and put her hand over his, there in the dirt of the garden, and held it. My father told me, she said carefully, in one of our last real conversations before the hospital. He told me that the bravest thing a person can do is let someone see them clearly. He said most people spend their whole lives making sure no one sees them clearly, because it's the thing that can hurt you the most. She paused. I see you clearly, Silas. I've been seeing you for months. And what I see... She stopped, drew a breath. What I see is the best man I've known since my father. And my father was extraordinary. The robin on the fence rail made its opinion of the morning known with some finality and departed. The creek ran in the canyon below them, cold and clear and purposeful, going where it had always been going. The new growth on the ponderosas caught the spring light and held it. Silas turned his hand over and held hers properly, the way he'd held it in February, directly, without ceremony, in the way he did everything that mattered to him. I love you, he said. Simple. Plain. Offered with the same honest directness he brought to everything else in his life, without performance or preamble. Just the truth, presented as it was. She had known it was coming, she realized. Had known it the way you know spring is coming even in the deepest part of winter. Not because you can see it yet, but because the knowledge of it has been living in you for months, growing quietly, waiting for the right moment to become a fact rather than a hope. I love you, she said. I have been loving you, I think, since the night you sat down in the snow beside me instead of above me. I just needed to be certain it was real and not gratitude. Is it real? He asked. It's the realest thing I have, she said. The barn was finished on a Friday in late April, and Silas stood back from it in the afternoon light and looked at it with the evaluating, unsentimental eye of a man assessing his own work. And what Elena saw on his face was satisfaction, quiet and genuine, the satisfaction of a thing rebuilt better than it was before, which is the best outcome destruction can produce. The Haskell family came that evening with food and a bottle of something warming, and old Bert Calla came on his dignified mule, and Warren Whitfield rode out from Ridgefall with his wife, whom Elena had not met, who turned out to be a sharp, funny woman named Clara, who took in the situation with the discerning eye of a person accustomed to reading rooms quickly, and said, within 15 minutes of arriving, I've heard about you for months, Mrs. Mercer, and I want you to know everything I've heard has been accurate. They built a fire in the paddock and ate together in the spring dark, and at some point someone produced a fiddle. It was the older Haskell boy who had the instrument and the ability with it and the youthful confidence to deploy both without being asked, and the evening acquired music, and the music acquired dancing, and Elena Mercer danced in the firelight on a spring evening in Frost Ridge Canyon with the neighbors who had become something closer than neighbors, and felt, in the center of all of it, a happiness so solid and unambiguous that it required no qualification. Silas did not dance. He stood at the edge of the firelight with a cup in his hands and watched her, and when she came to stand beside him, breathing from the exertion, he handed her his cup, and she drank from it and handed it back, and they stood together watching the fire and the dancing and the people they had come to be responsible to, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. Later, Crow found a moment beside Silas at the edge of the gathering and stood with him in the comfortable quiet of men who don't require conversation to share a space. She's something, Crow said with a nod toward Elena, who was in deep discussion with Clara Whitfield about something that appeared from a distance to involve considerable mutual enthusiasm. Yes, Silas said. Thomas Whitaker's daughter, Crow said. He'd be pleased. Silas looked at the fire for a moment. He'd say he just did what needed doing, he said. He'd say it worked out the way these things do when people are honest about what they need. Crow considered this. He'd be right, he said, and they stood in the spring night and let the fiddle music fill the silence. The summer that followed was the hardest working and most productive season Frost Ridge had seen in years, and not only on the Mercer homestead. With Blackthorn's fraudulent water rights dissolved, the Eastern Creek access was restored to the homesteaders along the canyon, which meant the Haskell cattle could graze the eastern range, and old Bert Calla's small operation recovered the irrigation it had lost in 1884 and became viable again for the first time in 4 years. The economic effects rippled outward in the practical, unglamorous way of genuine recovery. More money staying in Ridgefall, more goods being traded, more families making it through to the next season without the margin-shaving anxiety that had characterized life in the canyon under Blackthorn's shadow. Elena expanded the kitchen garden beyond its original plan because what it produced exceeded their own needs by enough to matter, and she established a trading arrangement with 4 neighboring families that functioned on principles her father would have recognized: mutual benefit, honest accounting, no one carrying more than their fair share of the risk. She wrote it all down in a new ledger, separate from the homestead accounts, and kept it at the back of the shelf where anyone could consult it who needed to. Silas rebuilt the hay barn and then rebuilt the outbuilding, and then, at Elena's suggestion and his own quietly growing vision of what the place could be, extended the paddock fence to accommodate 2 additional horses, because if the homestead was going to function as the kind of operation Elena had outlined in her plans, which he had read 3 times and found comprehensive and sound, they would need the capacity. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he had opinions about the garden that went beyond drainage correction. He found that he cared how the place looked, not for vanity, but because Elena had brought a quality of attention to the homestead that made everything within it feel worth caring about, and that quality was apparently contagious. He planted 3 young apple trees along the eastern fence in June because she had mentioned once in passing that her mother had kept an apple tree and that she missed the smell of them in summer. He hadn't mentioned this as the reason when he planted them. He didn't need to. She knew. In July, she wrote a letter to the Territorial Land Authority, formally documenting the community's testimony regarding the water rights restoration with supporting accounts from 7 families in the canyon. It was not required of her. It was the kind of thing her father would have done, creating a record not because anyone asked for one, but because the record would matter later to people she didn't yet know, and that was reason enough. Crow, when she told him about the letter, said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your father surveyed this canyon in 1882 and documented the truth. You came here in 1887 and did the same thing, in different ways." "He taught me how," she said simply. The summer turned to fall with the particular clean efficiency of high country seasons, and the garden Elena had planted in April yielded its first full harvest in September. Not a spectacular harvest, the first year never is, but a real one, real enough to put up stores and trade the surplus and feel the specific satisfaction of having pulled food from ground that had been nothing in November and frozen in January and tentative in April and was now, through sustained attention and honest work, producing. She was putting up the last of the tomatoes on a Tuesday in early October when she heard Silas come in from the fence repair he'd been doing all morning, and she heard something in his footsteps, a lightness, or rather an absence of the habitual weight she'd learned to read in the sounds of him moving through the house. And she turned from the stove. He had a letter in his hand. She recognized the territorial seal on the envelope. "The commission sent a formal acknowledgement," he said, "of your father's contribution to the proceeding." He looked at the letter and then at her. "They're naming the Frost Ridge Canyon Survey of 1882 as a foundational document in the new water rights registry for the Northwestern Territory. Every future claim in this canyon will be referenced against it." He paused. "They want to know if there's family who should be notified of the designation." Elena turned back to the stove for a moment and gave herself 3 seconds, which was what she needed. Then she turned back. "Tell them his daughter received the letter," she said, "and is grateful." Silas set the letter on the table and came across the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind. And she leaned back into him, and they stood in the kitchen of the cabin that had been his and was now theirs, while the October light came through the window they'd reseeded in August to stop the draft. And outside the apple trees he'd planted in June were dropping their first small leaves in the autumn wind, and the garden she'd planned since November was going to sleep for winter, having done what it came to do. "He would have loved this place," she said quietly. "He would have surveyed every inch of it," Silas said, "and documented it for posterity." She laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind her father had said she got from her mother, the kind that came out when something was true. Silas's arms tightened around her slightly, and she felt him smile against her hair, the full and unguarded version, the one she'd earned across all the months of careful, honest work it took to get here. Outside, Frost Ridge Canyon moved through its October afternoon. The creek running clear, the canyon walls burning amber and rust with the season's change. The new barn standing solid against the sky with the particular confident permanence of something built right, built to last, built by hands that understood the difference between a structure that merely stands and one that holds. Thomas Whitaker had ridden into this canyon in September of 1882 with his instruments and his notebooks, and he had measured the truth of the land and written it down because that was how he understood his work and his life. That accuracy was integrity, that documentation was a form of care, that the truth recorded was a gift to people you'd never meet who would need it someday. He had not known, riding those September trails with his surveying equipment, that the gift would come to his own daughter, that it would arrive exactly when she needed it most, in the middle of the hardest winter of her life, in the form of his own careful handwriting in a folder in a tin trunk, in a cabin at the edge of a canyon he'd passed through once and documented faithfully and never returned to. Some things are like that. Some things are built before you know what they're building toward. Some debts are called in years after they're made, in currencies that couldn't have been anticipated when the accounts were first opened. Some people leave the world and go on, in their careful work and their patient love, shaping the lives of the people they left behind in ways that unfold long after the shaping hand is gone. Elena Mercer stood in her kitchen in October with her husband's arms around her and her father's name in a government letter on the table and her first harvest put up on the shelves, and she understood all of this not as comfort exactly and not as grief exactly, but as something older and more durable than either. The knowledge that love, done honestly, does not end when the person who carries it does. It just finds new ground and grows.